Dear Stephen, I, along with many others, have watched the video in which you explained what you would say to God if you met him. And you explained how, because of a world in which we live of suffering and injustice, you'd have to tell that God that he's a mean, stupid maniac of a God. Now, I'm a Christian, and my first reaction to that was to want to tell you, look, I'll give you 5 bulletproof reasons for why that's not the way God is. But then I kind of realised actually you're not really giving an argument against God, more an expression of your anger that the world is the way it is if a God is in charge of it. And so rather than give you some kind of a philosophical rebuttal, I thought I'd tell you a story. Now, we probably don't have that much in common, but one thing we probably do share is a mutual love of the literary genius of this man, Oscar Wilde. That's why we're filming here today on a cold winter's day at his memorial in central London. Now, I know that you share a deep connection with Oscar Wilde, but I have something in common with him too, and that is that he believed in the same God that I believe in. I've just been reading recently to my kids Oscar Wilde's stories for children. They're absolutely brilliant, and actually I think they're for adults as well. My favourite definitely is the story of the selfish giant. I'm sure you're familiar with it, but I think Oscar Wilde in this story expresses actually the true nature of God. The story centres on a garden. It's a garden where it's always winter and never spring. Children used to play there, but they don't play there anymore. And it's all because of the giant's selfishness that has brought this down on this beautiful garden. Interestingly, the Christian story also begins with a garden. And however you interpret that story, fundamentally, it's about the idea that from the beginning, the world has gone wrong because of us. And in many ways, that's bent the whole world out of shape. So in a sense, we're living in the winter garden that Oscar Wilde describes. But in the story, after many years of it being winter and never spring in his garden, the giant sees a child at the end of the garden underneath a tree. And he has a change of heart, and he goes out and he lifts that child into the tree, and suddenly the tree blossoms, and suddenly winter is over, spring has arrived, the children come back, and even the giant's own heart is thawed because of it. But the child he so loves never reappears until the giant grows quite old, actually. And then, while it's winter again, and Wilde adds here, he didn't hate the winter now, for he knew that it was merely the spring asleep and that the flowers were resting. Well, he sees that child again at the end of the garden, underneath the same tree, but this time the tree is laden with gold and silver fruit. Well, Wilde takes up the story. Downstairs ran the giant in great joy, and out into the garden. He hastened across the grass and came near to the child, and when he came quite close, his face grew red with anger, and he said, "Who hath dared to wound thee?" For on the palms of the child's hands were the prints of 2 nails, and the prints of 2 nails were on the little feet. "Who hath dared to wound thee?" cried the giant. "Tell me, that I may take my big sword and slay him." "Nay," answered the child, "but these are the wounds of love." Oscar Wilde didn't believe that God was a tyrant who was basically out to make an evil world. Rather, in a world that's bent out of shape, where winter reigns and the blossoms are few and far between, he spoke of a God who comes into our world, into our darkness, and bears it with us. He talks about a cross and nails, nail prints in his hands and feet, and that these are the wounds of love. These are the defining characteristics of the God that he believes in. "Who art thou?" said the giant, and a strange awe fell on him, and he knelt before the little child. And the child smiled on the giant and said to him, "You let me play once in your garden. Today you shall come with me to my garden, which is paradise." And when the children ran in that afternoon, they found the giant lying dead under the tree, all covered with white blossoms. Now, I'm not saying that this gives a definitive answer to the problem of suffering and God. I think there are good reasons why God might allow suffering, but even if I could give you a brilliant explanation, that wouldn't be much good for the parent who has lost their child to bone cancer. But what might help them is to know that they're not alone in a universe where their fate is really on the roll of a dice and suffering is just a brute fact of our existence which has no ultimate answer. I think that for anyone who suffers, the idea that God himself would come in to our winter experience, bear our suffering with us and bring spring, well, that may be the only hope of making sense of any of the suffering that we all do experience in life. And I'd even dare to say that maybe a world in which that love can be expressed is the best kind of world that we can hope for. So, Stephen, I don't believe in your God standing guard at the pearly gates any more than you do. But I do believe in Oscar Wilde's God, a God who expresses himself as a child and who, on a tree, with nail prints in his hands and feet, brings in spring. That's a God worth believing in. Thanks for watching.